My name is Zethu Mashika. I am a film and TV composer. Let's talk about film scoring. All right. I think it's important for us to get a detailed understanding of what we're talking about when we're saying film and TV composing or film and TV scoring. When you score a film, when you score TV, you are doing more than one thing. You're not just adding music, you're not just adding mood music. One of the things you're doing is that firstly, you're creating the sonic identity of the world that's being built. Right? Then the director comes through with the story that they've written, and you need to color it in with the way that world feels. That's the sonic identity. Some movies, when you watch them and you listen to them, they feel a certain way, and that feeling gets carried with that music. When they play that music somewhere else, you're able to identify that world on the basis of what's been created on that music. So it's important to understand that the sonic identity of the film is one aspect. Then the other aspect of film scoring is emotional enhancement. Now, you are speaking in subtext. You're speaking in emotion. That's your job as the composer. Your language is emotion. So the little bits of information that you're not getting between the dialogue and the picture, that's where music fits in. And with film scoring, part of film scoring is knowing when not to put music in, when the only thing you're supposed to be hearing is the diegetic sound, the dialogue, and only the picture. There's not supposed to be any music. That is actually part of film scoring, knowing exactly when to put in music and when not to put in music. And so we're not just making music and just creating just the mood. You're also looking into the psychology of the story. You're looking into the deeper aspects of the story that cannot be communicated by the elements that you see. So the psychology of the relationships between characters, the relationships between people, and an understanding of that, which we'll get into in this workshop. All of those things play a very, very big part, and you have to tap into your experience in dealing with these subjects and dealing with these things. And that is where a lot of the music comes from, and understanding that's what that sounds like. You know, when we talk about manipulation, what does manipulation sound like? When we talk about true love, what does that sound like to you? And how would you then express that musically? But it needs to be in the context of the story. It needs to be in the context of the sonic world that you've built, and it needs to come from a very honest place. So when we say film scoring, we're looking at a multifaceted aspect of the film that is more than just making nice sounding notes and playing around with instruments and stuff like that. It's actually very, very detailed and complex. Now, the process of film scoring happens in more ways than one. There's the ideal way of how the process goes, and then there's the way that a lot of the time ends up playing out. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the ideal way of working, and that's when you get approached to do the score of film very early on, and this is during pre-production. This is after the story's been written and a lot of the elements are now being put together in the whole production. At that point, the conversation between you and the director needs to begin. They send you the script, and once you have the script, you read through the script. And for me, at this point in the production, when I read the script, that's when I start hearing some of the music. I start to get an idea of what I think this should feel like and what this would probably sound like. The creative process is already going at that point. And reading the script kind of helps you with the blank page dilemma. You know, when you start a very new project and you've got a blank page, it can be very, very scary and intimidating, and so you procrastinate. You know, you come up with excuses and all of that stuff, and it's pretty scary. You almost feel like you can't do this. It feels like maybe I'm not really a composer, maybe I'm not as good as I should be, because this is very scary and I don't even know how I'm going to start with this. I don't know how I'm going to do this. And so what really helps in getting past that is reading the script, because the minute you start reading the script and you start getting pulled in and your emotions start getting evolved and you start teleporting into that world, that's when, for me, a lot of the creative stuff begins. And sometimes I can't even read a script from beginning to end in one go. I start reading, and then the minute I start hearing something in my mind, I put the script down and I start sketching and I start composing whatever's in my head, not to picture, not to anything, just getting a sense of what it is and where it's going. And then from then on, once I'm done with that, I'll pick up the script again and I'll carry on. So it's at that point where those little sketches, they really help when having that conversation with the director, because you can now start bouncing ideas off each other. You can send that through to him, those sketches through to him or her, and you know, it'll help to test whether you guys are on the same page or not. And that's the most important part, is getting aligned with whatever it is that you guys are building together. You know, you can't be in opposing positions with the director. You guys have to be on the same page. And so getting those sketches out and getting them to the director is a good way to test how much you're on the same page. So they will then go into production. In some instances, that music may influence how things get shot. They may influence the story a little bit, and sometimes they don't. But those little sketches may or may not make it in the final film either. So you don't really know whether they're going to make it or not. In my case, a lot of the sketches that I did in the beginning always made it into the end, somewhere or another. I guess maybe I'm just lucky like that, you know. But then they go into production. I find it a lot better for me to go on set while they're shooting, get a feel of that world, get a sense of the world, speak to the characters, well, speak to the actors, but basically try to speak to the characters, you know what I mean? Get a sense of how they feel about the character, how they are, what they feel of this world, and all of that stuff, and try to get a very tangible feel of that world. And that also, again, fuels the creative process. So as soon as they're done with shooting, they finish shooting, they then start cutting and editing to whatever the editor is going to be editing to is probably going to be other music. Just for their process and for the purpose of getting their cut together, they edit to other music. I always prefer that I don't hear that music, because then I need to be as pure in my entry into scoring the film as possible. So they'll start editing, they'll give me a working cut, their first draft of the cut, which will probably sometimes be like an hour longer than the final film. But it's more to get a feel of where we're going and how the pacing and how things are going to be laid out. I then start my process of film scoring. That's when I get the other ideas. That's when I really get my teeth into scoring the film, is when the picture's right in front of me and I can now get a sense of exactly where we're going and where we are. And that's where the bulk of the composition really takes place. And that's where, you know, I will start my process of creating these sketches, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, the director will come in for something we call a spotting session. And that's when we basically watch the film and talk about the scenes and talk about where the music should be in there or not and what it should feel like. And it's a chance to get past all the things that I could get wrong, all the little details that the director's trying to communicate, all the little details that we could be missing. That's the time to now start cleaning up and being sure that we're really on the same page, that this character is going through this and this is what's happening here, and then clearing all of that out and saying, okay, we want music here, we don't want music here, and getting even better direction in terms of where we're going. Now, sometimes those things do change, where we've decided that we want to have music here, and then we later change it and say, nah, it actually plays out better when there isn't any music. So you don't hold on to those directions, you just use them as guiding lights in terms of where we're going. And yeah, then the process goes on, you carry on, you do your back and forths, and then eventually I can tell you now, the film doesn't get finished. There's always something you can go back and improve. It escapes because time runs out. But if it were up to me, I'd still be scoring Queen Sono right now. I'd probably still be scoring Uncovered, that was a year ago. And Queen Sono was actually Uncovered was 2 years ago. And Queen Sono was last year around this time. So you'll always want to improve it. You'll always wish you had more time, and 9 out of 10 times you won't have enough time. Even if they give you enough time, you won't have enough time because you'll procrastinate, you might start late, you might do all of these things, and you might have to get over the fear and all of that stuff. But that's basically where you end up. You end up at a place where you've got now this body of work, and you've now laid it out nicely into the film, and eventually it just escapes from you, and next thing you know, you're at the premiere. So that's the ideal way that the process goes. And the other way that it goes is that sometimes they just approach you when they're in post. They've got a first cut, and either the initial composer that they had couldn't be available, or they never had a composer in mind up until that point. And then they just literally take you and they throw you into that world, and they say, okay, let's try to do it. And that process is neither good nor bad. It's just another way where you don't get a chance to sketch based on the script. You just really start going on the picture, and which is, again, neither good or bad. So sometimes you just start in during post, which is actually what happened with Queen Sono. With Queen Sono, I came in during post. They had already gotten their first cut of the first episode and the second episode, and I got to watch them, and I got going. And luckily, it was very inspiring just watching the images that Moteo had put together and the story that Gagiso had put together. So that's the other way that it happens. You just come in post, and things just get going. Also, you have to be able to, as a composer, you have to be able to identify yourself as a particular kind of composer. There are composers where there are times when the director knows exactly what he wants with the music, and then you are forced to listen to the temp music, which composers will tell you how much we hate doing that. But you listen to the temp music and you try then adapt yourself to that temp music. And that's one type of composer. And then there's the other type of composer where we insist on the collaborative part of the creative process from scratch. And, creating it from scratch and trying to aim to create something completely new. I'm the latter. I prefer to create new sounds most of the time. I'm really not very keen on following the road that somebody else has sort of laid out. I really gravitate towards films that allow me to create something new and fresh. And I think it's important to be honest about that. Because you don't want to create weird relations where now, things are not working out creatively and this is a bit contrived and all of that stuff. So when you're able to get past that bit in the beginning where you know where you stand from the jump, it's very important, and it really helps with the creative process and creative freedom. So Yeah. So that's, to sum it up, that's the process. That's how a film gets scored from basically from start to finish. And later in this workshop, we're going to talk about some of the other tools and techniques that we use to be able to achieve certain goals within the film. Story, take one. Good. Now, the most important part about the entire film is the story. And you have to understand story. Now, even myself, there are times when I don't understand story that well. And I think it's hard to be able to separate certain things, for some of those things are intertwined, because you've got plot, you've got story. So I hope my writer friends don't laugh at me for this. I think the difference between story and plot is this, if I understand it correctly. Plot are the series of events that take place, whereas story is something else that is not the backdrop. So the plot will most of the time be the backdrop of what's happening. I'll give you an example. I did a film, the first feature film I did was called Zama Zama. The film, the events that take place in the film is that there's a mining boss, the guy who's like the manager, the mine manager, and they have to deal with illegal miners. And so they go through this process of trying to weed out the illegal miners in the mine. And in the process, his brother gets involved, and he has to stop the raid before they kill the brother, and so on and so forth. So the series of events is that it starts here, then we go into the mine, and then he comes across his brother, and he does all of these things, and then in the end they raid the place, and so on and so forth, and what. That is the plot. But the story in the midst of all of that is about two brothers and the reunification of the brothers. That is the story. And then the mining aspect is the backdrop. And I'll give you another example. A few years later from that, I did a film called Last Ones Out. And with Last Ones Out, it was about zombies in South Africa. The whole country had gone into a state of emergency. There were zombies everywhere. People had died. And you had these people that were the last people to get out of the country safely. So that's the plot, is that what happens is people are trying to get out safely. But the story is about how it was actually about love. How this guy met this girl and they understood the importance of not leaving the other. No one gets left behind. That is the story. Whereas the zombies are the backdrop, they're the plot. And you have to be able to separate those two things so that you know what you're focusing on in certain instances. Because then your music gets broken up. It gets broken up into plot point, following the plot, or you following the story. And your themes will be dictated by what's happening, but they'll also be dictated whether what's more important here. Is it the story, or is it the plot, or is it both? Whatever the case may be. And so your themes mostly will fall towards the story side. And then your sonic identity will fall towards your plot side. And now you need to be able to understand that story. And that's why that conversation with the director is important. Because he'll be able to outline to you and say, this story is about this. This is how we tell that story. Yes, there, you see, there it is. The plot is how you tell the story. The story is still just the story. So the plot is the method. So having that conversation with the director is very, very important, because then it helps you to be able to map it out and say, okay, we're creating the sonic identity, and this is how we're going to go ahead and tell the story in this way. But the themes, the characters, how you build their themes, how you build the subject matters, like the story themes. When we're talking about maybe the love aspect in the love theme, and how you create and compose for that, and then maybe the theme of duality, how then you need to find a way to compose for that as well. So you're composing for the characters, you're composing for the themes of the story, you're composing for the plot. There's so many things to consider, and with experience you learn when to do what. You learn when is it time to focus on the plot, when is it time to and knowing all of these things in advance, kind of like, the more you do this, the more you'll know. It will come naturally to know that, okay, here we're not just focusing on the drama, we're not just heightening the tension, we're actually pulling back and we're focusing on how they're feeling. Even though there's guns blazing, there's bullets flying everywhere, it's not always about creating that fast-paced music because there's that much action happening. Sometimes you have to pull back and then focus on the emotional content of that scene, and say, even though bazookas and explosions are going off right now, there is an emotional bond happening between these two soldiers because they're in this mess together, but there's a very particular bond, and sometimes that's what you compose for. That's what you create the music for, because we know that they're already fighting. There's already that information on the screen, like it's already tense. Their performances are telling you that it's tense. The world is falling apart. That's already telling you that. So what is the thing that you're not getting from the dialogue and the picture? The bond. And that bond is what you then take and you heighten. So the more you do it, the more you'll understand that you have to be able to identify what you're scoring for. There was a scene that I did in Queen Sono. And what was cool about Queen Sono is that working with Kagiso Lediga, he's very we have very deep discussions about what we're doing. And he'll watch it and then he'll give his opinion about certain things, but he'll give me an opportunity to explain exactly what I was going for, and then he'll give it another watch with that in mind. 9 out of 10 times I'll change his mind, because sometimes we see things that the director doesn't, and we hear things that the director may not even begin to imagine, which is why they hand that part of the film over to us. So in Queen Sono, there was a scene where unfortunately got taken out, because how that situation goes, where I was scoring on the basis of what one of the characters' eyes were doing, and his expression, and what the expression was saying. And it wasn't about what was just happening. They had just basically diverted the enemy and they had escaped, but I didn't score according to their escape. I scored according to their the way they feel about the job, and the way they fit into it emotionally. They know they're cool. They know they're good at it. They're not even afraid. They're just like heroes in a way. And I could see that in the character's eyes, and seeing that in the character's eyes was the perfect way to bring that aspect out, to say, these guys are pros, they're really cool, they know what they're doing, they're not worried, they're not even afraid, they're just like real heroes. And so that's what I was trying to pull out, that's what I was pulling out of the scene. And so when he watched it for the first time, he was like, I'm not sure this should feel like this. And I'm like, okay, watch it again, but look at his face when you're busy watching it. And immediately he got it, and it stayed. He liked it. He's like, okay, don't change it. Eventually that whole scene got taken out, so you don't get an opportunity to see it. But those discussions are so important, and just knowing exactly where you fit in, knowing exactly what you're supposed to do, knowing what you're doing it for, every single note, at least from in my case, I can explain every single note that I put in. I can explain the instruments. I can explain exactly what I'm going for, and I can tell you why I do A, B, and C. With Queen Sono, I was given the freedom to decide exactly what I do and when I do it. And that freedom to decide added a lot more pressure to do my best work. And that's the kind of pressure that I always wish to have when working on a project, to get my best work out, is being given that freedom and the ownership of the score and say, you're the doctor, make a prescription for what we need for this music, and we'll talk about it afterwards. And that is the best way for a composer to work. There's no better way for a composer to do the best thing he can do for the story, make those decisions, and create that world. There is a specific way you deal with and communicate with directors. And there's certain things to understand about them and how a lot of them think. Well, they're different. But directors are the captain of the ship in the case of a film. In TV series, the showrunner is the captain of the ship. And you have to be able to know the difference of who you're talking to and when and so on. But in this instance, we're going to talk about directors. See, directors have the big vision for whatever they're trying to do. And the music of a film is usually a very sensitive discussion and part of the film, because it's the one aspect that they don't have control over. They have to let it go, and they have to trust somebody else to get that out. And 9 out of 10 times, they don't know what they're going to get out. They don't know what notes I'm going to put together. They don't know what it's going to sound like until they hear it. And they can be a bit nervous about it, because not only the reason they don't know what it's going to sound like is because, one, it's not coming from their brain, it's coming from somebody else's brain. And two, a lot of the time they don't know how to make music, they don't know how to compose. And so it's hard for them to be able to conceptualize exactly what they want from the film. And so sometimes that's why they need help with temp music during edit, to be able to lock down exactly what it is they want. But even then, when they hand that film over to a composer, they don't know what they're going to get. Essentially, when a director looks at you as a composer, and when a director chooses you as a composer, they're choosing you on the basis of your perspective of the world, your perspective of the story, and that's what they're basically investing in. The way you see the story, the way you see the world, the way you relate to the characters and to that world, and how that world, how you interact with that world. And so even then, they still don't know what they're going to get out. And so there's a way to communicate with directors, and there's a way to working with them in such a way that you have to be sure that they're comfortable. You have to be sure that I've got this figured out. Don't worry, this is going to be amazing. It's going to be great. Even when you don't know yourself, even though you are afraid that I don't know what the hell I'm doing, I don't know how I'm going to get to the bottom of it, you have to give them something to be confident in, and you have to make sure that they're going to be okay. Make sure they know they're going to be okay, because this part can be a bit stressful for them. It's having an aspect in your movie that you couldn't think up, that you don't know what it's going to sound like, and hoping that it fits. It can be a bit tough. And because of that creative complexity, there are going to be many instances where you get fired from scoring. The reason you get fired is not because you suck. It's mainly because there are times where there's just creative differences. the ideas you have in mind for the film versus what the director may have in mind, and whether that what evokes that feeling for you may evoke something different for the director, because it's all subjective. I'll play a piece of music in major chords only, and somebody will hear it and say that's really, really sad, and somebody will be like, wow, that's such a good feeling, good feel type of song. You just don't know how people are going to respond to it. And so you just need to be as honest with yourself as possible. And if whatever comes out of that honesty does not work with the director's vision, it is okay. It's not because you're bad, it's just creative differences, and it's okay for you guys to walk away from each other, and for him to find somebody that can bring the film to the best form for him or her. So you need to understand those complexities of creative differences, and the complexities of trying to find that middle ground, and trying to find that common ground in emotion when it comes to music. There are people you'll sit with and you'll listen to the same songs and the same feelings get evoked, and that's what you're looking for. But there are cases where there's music that makes you very sad and somebody makes them very happy. You don't get that, and sometimes that can cause a little bit of, not friction, but like that can cause the story not to be in harmony. So you need to understand all of these things, and what you're striving for is to finding the common ground between you and the director, making sure that they feel okay in this journey that you're taking them through, and letting them know that they can have that faith in you, and everything's going to be okay. You will finish the scoring it, and it is going to sound amazing. And sometimes when they start hearing certain tracks, they start to become more comfortable and all of this stuff. And another thing to point out is that when speaking to a director, speak only about emotion. Don't speak notes, don't speak musical jargon, don't get too technical. Just speak about emotion, and do more demonstrating than you do talking, because the talking part can get sometimes it can get in the way, and it can really confuse things when too much gets said. I know that when speaking to the director for the first time, I try to minimize the things that I'm saying about what I'm going to do. I just do them. And then after doing them, then I show them, and then I explain after showing them. But talking about it in advance can send the director in a very particular path. And you can't control that. And then when you play the music, it sounds like something completely different. And then there's it just gets confusing. And also, try to minimize communicating with too many people. In an ideal space, it'll just be you and the director in the room. When you guys are listening to the music and you guys are having these discussions and all, it'll just be you and the director. Try to make sure that's the case. The minute you have the editor in the room, if the editor's not there talking technical things and is also contributing to how he thinks that's where you start having problems. Because too many cooks, too many opinions, too many can really make a very big mess of things. So just have that very, very isolated isolated space. The only thing you should be saying to the editor is, I need the cut in this format, and so on and so forth. And then if they're explaining to you how the cut's going to change, or all of these technical aspects, cool. But from the creative side, keep it here. Keep it very close. Even the producers should try not to get involved too much in that process, because again, too many opinions can really mess up what you guys are trying to do. So if you have an option and you have the say in the mix, try to keep it that way. It's usually unavoidable. Sometimes the producer will insist on being there and will insist on putting their 2 cents, and that's also okay sometimes, because sometimes they do have good input and they sometimes do contribute it. But if I'm being honest about that whole situation, when you're really getting into the meat of it, minimize the number of people in the room. it makes things that much clearer, because too many different opinions people think they're talking about the same thing, and 9 out of 10 times they're not. So isolate it, let it be just purely you guys, and just try to keep on focusing on the emotional content and minimize on the technical aspect of music that confuses them, and sometimes that will confuse you too. So that's to sum it up, how you try to interact with the director when you're scoring a project. It's you'll figure it out as it goes, and you'll start to see that directors have different personalities, and you'll learn how to work around their personalities and see how they work and all that stuff, and figure that out. But it's something that happens over time as well. You have to know your characters. You have to know what their arc is. You have to know what motivates them. You have to know their weaknesses. And this is, I'm going to start becoming a bit subjective when talking about characters. I'm not speaking for all composers when I say all of the stuff I'm about to say, but I think what I try to do is I try to understand the character, and I try to completely relate with the character. Understand why they feel the way they feel, why they want to do what they want to do, and become them in a way. Because, you know, every character that's ever been written, well, most characters that have ever been written, they've been written by a human being. And there is a little bit of whatever the character is, there's a little bit of that in everyone. And when you're honest about that, and you know that there is like a little bit of darkness in you, there's a little bit of all of these, traits that we don't identify ourselves by. Those little things actually exist in you. And when you're a composer, and you're talking about characters, you have to be able to understand that you 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 have to tap into that thing that defines that character. That way, the relatability, the understanding of the character becomes a lot easier. Rather than trying to say, I'm not like him, I'm not like him, I'm not like them, um, find things about you that are. That way, you really get into the mind of the character. You really start to move and think in a way like the character does. And again, all of this is supposed to feed into the music. It's supposed to feed into those compositions. It's places that you go to go get that content from. So you have to find ways to relate with that character, even if that character is completely what you would believe completely opposite to who you are. You have to step outside of yourself, and you need to step into their shoes, and you need to become them. And once you become them, the themes make sense. Now, when you it's not always about, okay, this is the antagonist. This person needs to sound bad, and they need to sound scary. That's not always what you're trying to do. There are instances where, I think personally, good writers are people who create relatable villains, because that conflict at the end of the day is very important, and the conflict comes from, ah, man, if I was this guy, I might have done the same thing too. And then having to decide which side you fall on. You know, one of the greatest villains that were written for Marvel is um, the antagonist of Black Panther, Killmonger. I related with Killmonger. I was with him the whole time, and to me, Black Panther's the villain, because he's just in the way of what I truly believe in. It was easy to relate with Killmonger because there was an honesty about him, and what he wanted to do was to do what was right for Black people, I guess. And so that conflict is what made the film very interesting, because you're on the fence, you're on both sides. So when writers write relatable characters, it helps so much to create that music for those characters. But your part in the mix is to find those things that you relate with those characters. Understand that psychology. It really brings you into the way they think. And you know, psychology is such an important part of this. Knowing how people think, knowing how people may react, is a very, very important part of how you create music for film. That's one of the things that like kind of like separate composing music for film versus just composing music for enjoyment and for pleasure, is that there's so many things that feed into every single note that you do, and psychology being one of them. I'm trying to compose um, for the fact that I can relate with why Killmonger wants to do ABC. I can relate with why Katerina Gromova wants to do whatever she's doing. And I understand that, and I have to try to understand that as much as possible, and I have to be with that. And then once I'm honest with that, the music becomes more compelling. The music adds to the duality of the film and adds to creating those two polarities between the antagonist and the protagonist. And you're with the protagonist. It's easy to be with the protagonist because they're the hero. That's the side you most of the time fall on. But like, my job is to pull you into the other side and make you understand that things are not that simple. You don't just fall on one side and then you just, Bob's your uncle. I'm going to throw you off a little bit and make you like the bad guy a little bit, and just to make it a little bit more interesting. That's when you have, what is it, the unstoppable wind and the immovable wall, and now eventually one has to cancel the other out. But things become more interesting when things make sense on both sides, but they're opposing sides. So understanding psychology, understanding your characters. Again, because I work with cool directors now and then, on Queen Sono, um, the character Ekaterina Gromova, she basically is the daughter of one of the Russian oligarchs, and I like talking about this because you sometimes never get an opportunity to go this far in character development in music. Um, Ekaterina is obviously the daughter of a Russian oligarch. I just had to look at the person herself and understand the things that motivate her, the things that she likes, the things she doesn't like, the kind of person that she is. So her background, her culture is a very big part of who she is. And so I had to take a lot of these things into account. So what I did, in actual fact, when creating the theme for Katarina, is that in Zulu, in African culture, we've got Itagazelo. So what I decided to do was write Istagazelo for her family. And I wrote it basically what her family stands for, what they're about, and I wrote this Istagazelo. Then I asked a friend of mine to translate it into Russian, and then I got to send that over to another friend in Russia, and they helped me musicalize it a bit, and then that became the vocals of Ekaterina Gromova. And the lady singing it also was very cool because she was understanding of what we were trying to do. And so she sang it in such a beautiful way that we were able to create the two aspect of one of the two aspects of Ekaterina Gormova. And the two aspects are, there's the powerful version that is who she is becoming or who she is now, and then there's the little girl. Now we know we don't get to see the little girl, but in one of the scenes we get to feel the little girl when she's about to kill her dad. Spoiler alert. When she's about to kill her dad, she goes back and she talks about when she was a child and how the dad treated her. And the music does the same. When the music starts and the lady's singing, she's singing in a very innocent way. And when we start to get into that point where we're talking about her childhood, the music also comes all the way down, and it's almost very childlike in the way that those harps are played. We're getting into what she's like as a child, and then as she's making the move and taking the step in becoming the powerful version of who she is, that's when you hear that the singing voice has become a lot more mature, a lot more strong. And all of these little aspects really add onto that music, and all these things that you know about the character, all these things that you relate with about the character. I mean, I know I have a very weird relationship with power. And so I just tapped into the weird relationship I have with power, and I just moved around in that world. And a lot of the things that she goes through when she's dealing with the power she has or trying to acquire power, I could relate with that. I could understand that. I could understand why she was doing what she was doing to some extent. And all of that stuff feeds into the music. All of those details are in the notes of the music. And there's always a wealth of motivation or inspiration in knowing the characters and in knowing the story and knowing that world well enough for you to be able to just pull from that. Sometimes it's not even that hard to do that, but sometimes it can be, depending on your relatability with that world. And so this is where you have to pull from yourself, look at the relationships you have with people, get to know people. Sometimes when you meet people, spend more time listening than talking, because we all like to hear the sound of our own voices. Spend more time listening, and you'll learn so many things about so many different characters in the world, so many different things that are happening in the world, and finding your way in all of this stuff, and opening up your imagination to what that may sound like and what that feels like. All of these things are places that you draw inspiration from. All of these things are places that you find that inspiration and the sound of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. So always get to know your characters. Speak to the director about the characters. Ask him a random question sometimes, and it's not really random. Sometimes I'll be like, on a Sunday afternoon, what would this person be eating? What would this person be doing? What would they be thinking? Get like a really, really as deep understanding of the character as possible. Then the music basically just writes itself. It just basically it starts flowing. Know your characters. They are very, very important in being able to define them, and each one has to be distinct sonically. Dialogue is the most important thing that's happening in a film. As long as you remember that part, life becomes a lot easier. Dialogue always comes first. Always comes first. When you mix your score, if you're mixing it yourself, always remember that you don't mix it as though you would mix and master an album. It's different. When you're mixing for picture, you always have dialogue in mind. You're always making way for dialogue and some of the important sound design. And it's important that if you're not mixing it yourself, sometimes that might actually be better, that you get somebody else who's done this for many years to mix your scores for you. A good mixer will mix your music in a way that you're able to make it as loud as possible without it getting in the way of anything, so that it's audible. That's what a good mixer does. They aim to get just for it to be existent and for it to be as loud as possible. And that takes a lot of experience, and it takes a trained ear to do that. And for that, for me personally, with certain projects, especially projects that need to be mixed in 5.1, if you don't know how 5.1 works and you've never mixed in 5.1, don't do it yourself. Learn it, but don't do it yourself on a serious project that's already running. Hand it over to somebody that does it. Let them do it for you, and give yourself time to figuring it out and learning and practice on past projects or projects that are not either on anything that's not running or important. Take the time, practice, figure it out, learn the room dimensions, learn where things go in 5.1, but don't do it yourself if you don't know what you're doing. Don't. Just hand it over to somebody who knows. And take the time in finding that score mixer that will understand how you like your music to be presented, and build a relationship with them so that you work closely with them so that your turnaround is a lot faster. You don't want to keep working with different people because that just complicates your life, because every single time you work with somebody new, you have to learn how they work, they have to learn how you work. It's a whole endless back and forth on trying to figure each other out. So rather do that once, and once you found that person, let that be the person that helps you do that. Also important to understand how they do what they do, and you also take yourself through the process of learning, not to replace them at a later stage, but to be able to get to that level of quality by yourself. It's important to know what they do. It's important to understand why they do what they do and how they do it, so that you can grow as a mixer yourself. Because there might come a time where they're not available for you, for your work, and they're busy with big projects on their own or whatever the case may be, and you still need to be able to deliver. So you're always learning with film scoring. You're always becoming a better composer in many ways, and the learning never stops because that world is always changing. The technology is always developing very quickly. So you try to know as much as you can, but the important fundamentals of mixing is that you're not just mixing because you want it to just sound nice. You're mixing for it to fit nicely, to sound good, to sound very nice, but to fit with the dialogue and the other sound design, and for it not to get in the way. Sometimes if you make things too bright, they stick out and you hear them. And there's so many technical aspects to mixing for film that sometimes it's better to be in the size of the room that you're mixing for. So some of the guys who mix for feature films, they'll take their music and reference it in a cinema so that they can hear how it translates, and it will inform your mixing decisions again after that. So I know in South Africa we don't always have access to that kind of stuff, but there are people who do, and finding the people that have those facilities and working closely with them, building relationships with them, allows you to get to that level of quality, easily, better, So all of these things you have to learn. Mixing is a process that you learn over time, and it can be very hard to understand, but the more you do it, the better you become at it. But always remember, when you're mixing, there's no mastering yet. When you master it, that's when you're putting it on an album, and you're gonna then now put it on Tidal or Apple Music. But when there's no mastering, when you getting it ready for film, you just get to the best mix that you can, and then once you have that best mix then gets mixed in with all these other things, and then they do their final mix on top of that. So always remember that with mixing, it's just rather consult if you don't know what it is, and get yourself into the process of knowing exactly what's required. It will take time, but you'll figure it out eventually. So this is the part that nobody really likes to talk about that much, and the stuff that we wish we never had to deal with, and that's, the admin, the basic music business of film scoring, or of music in general, I guess. See, the thing is with music business, it's it's better to get assistance with certain things. You most likely, because most of you, well, I'm from South Africa, so being in South Africa, the businesses may be different to other parts of the world. Here, a lot of the time, you're not gonna get the highest budgets in the projects. It can happen now and then when you're lucky, but you usually don't get that. And that means it's important to negotiate that you get to keep your back end. Now, back end is the publishing rights, and your composer's share stays with you always, but then there's also the publishing rights as well. So you kind of have to go and sit down, go to Samro, go to Capasso, and ask them how to explain it to you in the simplest way how this whole thing works, because it can get a bit complicated, but it's important that you know it, because you could lose out on a lot of money not knowing how your rights and your mechanicals and your publishing and your performance royalties work. So to try simplify it, you've got there's different types of rights. Mechanical rights is basically when your song gets sold, in terms of like when you've got a hard copy. Say for example, you've got a song and you put it on Apple Music or another platform where people buy copies of the song. That is mostly the mechanicals, the actual hard copy of the song, like the actual file, the way the file is after it's been rendered. That's how I understand it to be the mechanical part of it. So in hip hop, a lot of the time, some people sample from the mechanical, which is why they have to pay royalties. But you still have to get permission if you use the same formula by recreating the music. This is getting confusing. Okay, let me try again. Mechanicals is basically that file as it is when it's been rendered. It's the sound recording. And there are rights attached to that. And every time they use those rights, every time those rights get played or get used somewhere, there are royalties that are supposed to come through to you. The same thing applies when there's performance in terms of publishing. And I think publishing refers more to the formula at which your song is made up of. So the way the melodic structure is, that formula, I would think that goes towards more the publishing side. And whenever that gets played or gets used, there are royalties attached to that. Now, again, please do your research on this and get to a point where you understand it really well. It's still something I'm also trying to figure out, but basically, you have to try and retain these rights as often as possible, especially if the upfront fee for your compositions is little. Try to own these so that whenever the channels and the cinemas play the music, they keep track of it when you send them cue sheets. And when you send them cue sheets, they take those cue sheets and then they keep track of all the music of yours that they've played, and you're supposed to get royalties from that. Okay, I'll go over it again one last time. Basically, let me illustrate it this way. I'll compose music for a series. What happens is I'll keep track of all the tracks that I've composed, how long they each are, and I'll put them on what we call a cue sheet that has all that information. The author, the composer, that's usually both myself, the duration of the song, the name of the song, and which show or which episode it's for. Now, I submit those along with the music. When they take that music and they put it in the show, and then the show airs, they submit those cue sheets to the channel, and then the channel has a record of the music that they've used. That's the information they then go to Samro with and say, this is the amount of tracks that we've used this year. These are the tracks. This is how long they played for, and so on and so forth. And then Samro then dishes out money that they get from channel to pay for the royalties. So they're supposed to pay royalties for every single piece of music that they play, unless they own it. But if you own the music, there's performance royalties that need to be paid out to you. So the same thing goes with Capasso. Capasso works with mechanicals. Samro works with performance and publishing. So make sure you visit those two places and get to know them, get to understand exactly what you need to be doing, and get to understand your contracts. Make sure that whenever you draw out a contract or you receive a contract, that you understand every aspect of that contract and what each thing means. I've got a personal contract that I work with, and I know it basically inside out. And I know that every time I sign this contract with the channel, or I sign this contract with the production company, I know exactly where I am in the big scheme of things. Sometimes, obviously, the bigger channels like Netflix, they'll send you their very own contract. Make sure you understand it. Make sure you know exactly what that means. And with Netflix, they usually buy you out in terms of the publishing and all of that stuff and the mechanicals. They usually prefer to own that, but they make up for it by giving you a bigger upfront fee. So it's worth it when you give up the rights to the music. So get to know these things, get to understand them, and be in a better position to negotiate whenever you're about to start a new project and all of that stuff. And just make sure that you are aware of everything that's happening and what each word means of a contract. For example, the sound recording refers to the mechanical, and sometimes those contracts get a bit tricky where they say, where you might forget to mention in the contract that the sound recording, the rights of the sound recording still vest in the composer. Sometimes when you don't mention that, it could be, a bit weird. They might feel like they own the sound recordings and whatnot. So a lot of the terms, make sure that you consult a lawyer and make sure that you're very, very aware of what's happening in there. So yeah, get to know your music business and try to make as much money as you can. So yeah, I think it's safe to assume that most people who are going to be watching this are people who want to be film composers or people who already are film composers. And the main thing I can say to you is that, when you're true to the art and you're true to yourself, it gets easier, it gets better, it becomes more fun, and you really begin to flourish. If this is something that you truly love, if this is something that you truly hope to make it the rest of your life, just be true to yourself, be true to the feeling, and focus more on becoming better, focus more on doing amazing work. The money just comes with it. It will come. Try not to do this for the money. Try not to think about the money when you're doing this. And if you need to get other work somewhere else and do this on the side, do what you need to do. But focus more on becoming better, focus more on doing amazing work. And I swear that, it is extremely rewarding. It is probably the best things on this planet, well, at least for me and stuff. So do your research, do your work, and I hope you're inspired. I hope you learned a lot from this masterclass, and I'll see you on the other side. Thank you.